Celeste Sinclair had it all: a loving husband, a beautiful son, and a life of luxury. But in the dead of night, everything shattered. Her millionaire husband, Graham, abandoned her without remorse, leaving her with nothing but a broken heart and a child to raise alone. While he ran off with a younger woman, Celeste clawed her way out of the ruins, turning her pain into power. Years later, at the peak of the fashion world, she steps onto a stage where Graham least expects, draped in success, with the son he left behind standing proudly at her side. Now as he watches the family he discarded thrive without him, desperation sets in. He wants redemption, but some betrayals are unforgivable. Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Celeste Sinclair moved through the grand halls of her estate with the grace of a woman who had mastered the art of being invisible. The chandeliers sparkled, the air smelled of fresh-cut roses, and every inch of the mansion exuded wealth, but she felt like a ghost drifting through someone else's dream. Her life, once filled with love and passion, had turned into a cold, empty space. She glanced at the dining room where the long mahogany table had been set for dinner. The candles flickered against the polished silverware, and the scent of roasted lamb filled the air. But as always, Graham was late. He had been late a lot recently, late to family dinners, late to date nights, late to everything that mattered to her. Celeste pressed her hands against her dress, smoothing out the fabric as she turned to check on Elijah. Their son, only 8 years old, sat in his chair, swinging, his feet beneath the table as he played with his napkin. His curls bounced with every small movement. His face still round with childhood, but his eyes were far too knowing. He had started noticing things: the tension in the air, the way his father barely spoke to his mother anymore, the way Celeste's smile felt forced. "Daddy's late again," Elijah murmured, stabbing his fork into a piece of bread. "He's busy," Celeste replied, though the words tasted bitter. She wanted to believe that was all it was, that work had consumed him, that late nights at the office were just part of his growing empire. She wanted to believe the man she had loved for years wasn't slipping through her fingers like silk unraveling at the seams, but she knew better. Her suspicions turned into confirmation when Graham finally walked through the door. Hours later, his tie loose, his shirt slightly wrinkled. He didn't even meet her gaze as he poured himself a drink. The smell of perfume clung to his clothes, one that Celeste didn't wear. She watched him, waiting, hoping for some sign of remorse, an apology, an explanation. Instead, he took a slow sip of whiskey, exhaled, and set the glass down with a quiet clink. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice eerily calm. Celeste's stomach twisted into knots. "Then talk." Graham looked at her for the first time in days. His gaze was distant, detached. "I'm leaving." The words sliced through the air like a blade. For a moment, Celeste thought she had misheard him. The room seemed to close in, the candlelight flickering against his sharp features, casting shadows over the man she no longer recognized. "Elijah, go to your room," Celeste whispered, her voice barely steady. Her son hesitated, looking between his parents, sensing the weight of the moment, but he obeyed, slipping out of his chair and disappearing down the hall. The silence left behind was deafening. Celeste clenched her fists. "Leaving?" Graham sighed, as if he were exhausted by the very conversation. "I've been unhappy for a long time. I need more than this, more than—" He waved his hand vaguely, gesturing toward their life, their home, their family. "I need to do what's best for me." Anger burned beneath Celeste's skin. "Best for you?" she hissed. "What about Elijah? What about me?" Graham didn't flinch. "I'll make sure you and Elijah are taken care of financially." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You think this is about money?" For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, not regret. "I've met someone," he said finally. "Her name is Victoria." The name meant nothing to Celeste, but the implication did. She stared at him, breathless, feeling the ground beneath her shift. "You've already moved on," she whispered, realization crashing down on her. "And you expect me to just, what, smile and accept it?" "I expect you to understand," Graham said, his tone clipped, as if she were the unreasonable one. "I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did." Celeste stood there, frozen, watching the man she had loved unravel before her eyes. He had made his choice. He was leaving, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. But deep inside, beneath the heartbreak, beneath the betrayal, something else stirred, a fire. Celeste sat motionless on the edge of her bed, staring at the half-packed suitcase in front of her. The walls of the grand bedroom, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating. Graham had given her a deadline, to leave by the end of the week, as if she were some forgotten tenant being evicted from his life, as if she hadn't built this home with him, as if their vows had meant nothing. She pressed a trembling hand against her forehead, inhaling sharply to keep herself from breaking down. Elijah was sleeping in the next room, curled up in his blankets, blissfully unaware of the storm waiting for him when he woke up. How was she supposed to tell him? How was she supposed to explain that the father he adored had chosen someone else? The front door creaked open downstairs. Celeste's body tensed. She had thought Graham had gone for the night, but his heavy footsteps echoed up the marble staircase. He didn't even knock before stepping inside. He was still in his suit, but his tie was gone, his collar unbuttoned. He had the nerve to look tired. "I came to check if you'd started packing," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Celeste lifted her head slowly, the fire inside her, the one ignited when he uttered the words "I'm leaving," burned hotter now. "I didn't realize I needed to report to you," she said coldly. Graham sighed. "Celeste, I don't want to drag this out. I've made my decision." Her jaw tightened. "You made a decision for yourself. You didn't consider Elijah, and you sure as hell didn't consider me." "I did consider you," he countered, rubbing his temple. "I could have been cruel, taken you to court, fought for full custody." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You wouldn't dare." Something flickered in his eyes, but it wasn't regret. It was annoyance. Graham had always hated being challenged. He had spent years shaping himself into the perfect businessman, the perfect provider. He thought money could solve everything. "I'm making sure you and Elijah are taken care of," he said, as if he were doing her a favor. "I'll set up an account, a trust fund. You won't have to struggle." Celeste stood up, her fists clenched. "You really think I care about your damn money?" Her voice shook, but not with fear, with fury. "You think you can buy me off? Send us away with a check while you play house with your mistress?" Graham exhaled sharply. "I don't expect you to understand." She took a step closer. "And I don't expect you to care. You never did." For the first time, Graham hesitated, but it was brief. He straightened his shoulders, his expression unreadable. "I'll have my lawyer draft the papers. You should be out by Friday." And, with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Celeste standing in the wreckage of the life he had just discarded. But she would not crumble. Not now. Not ever. Celeste tightened her coat around herself as she walked up the narrow apartment stairs, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. The weight of everything pressed down on her, her belongings shoved into cheap plastic bins, Elijah's quiet confusion, the humiliating reality that she had gone from a mansion to a cramped two-bedroom in a neighborhood she never imagined living. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air stale from disuse. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but it was theirs. It was all she could afford with what little money she had left. Graham had wired her the first installment of the financial agreement, but she hadn't touched it. She refused to. Let his money keep her afloat. If she was going to rebuild, it would be on her own terms. Elijah sat on the floor, drawing on the back of a discarded envelope. His little legs were folded beneath him, his curls bouncing as he moved his crayon across the paper. Celeste knelt beside him, brushing his hair back. "Are you hungry, baby?" she asked gently. He nodded but didn't look up. He hadn't said much since they left. Celeste's heart ached. She had tried to explain, tried to soften the blow. But how do you tell an 8-year-old that his father had chosen someone else? That their family wasn't enough? She kissed his forehead and stood, walking to the small kitchen. She rummaged through the bags of groceries she had bought with the last of her savings and started making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. As she spread the peanut butter, her hands stilled. This was her life now, struggling to make ends meet, wondering how long she could stretch every dollar, but she wouldn't let it break her. The next morning she woke before dawn, exhaustion pulling at her bones, but there was no time for self-pity. She needed a job. She spent the day going from boutique to boutique, carrying the worn portfolio of designs she had once dreamed of presenting to the world. But doors slammed in her face. "We're not hiring. Your work is good, but we're looking for more established designers. Try somewhere smaller." By noon, her feet ached, but she refused to stop. The final boutique on her list was nestled between a coffee shop and a high-end dress store. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. The scent of expensive fabrics filled the air. Mannequins dressed in elegant gowns lined the walls, and behind the counter stood a woman with sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing Celeste's worn coat with thinly veiled judgment. Celeste swallowed her pride and placed her portfolio on the counter. "I'm looking for work." The woman, Isabella DuPont, arched an eyebrow before flipping open the first page. A slow smile spread across her lips. "Now this," she said, tapping the sketch, "is interesting." Celeste sat on the edge of a velvet stool in Isabella DuPont's office, her fingers gripping the worn edges of her portfolio. The boutique was luxurious. Every detail, from the gold-trimmed mirrors to the silk drapes, screamed exclusivity. It was the kind of place she used to shop in with Graham, back when her life had been wrapped in wealth and comfort. Now she was, on the other side, desperate for a chance. Isabella flipped through the sketches slowly, her expression unreadable. Celeste kept her breath steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. These designs were all she had left of herself, of the dreams she had abandoned when she became Graham Sinclair's wife. "These are bold," Isabella murmured, tracing her manicured nail over one of the drawings. "Not quite the style I sell here, but there's something intriguing about them." She shut the portfolio and leaned back in her chair. "Where did you train?" Celeste hesitated. "I never finished design school," she admitted. "I had to leave when I got married." Isabella's lips twitched as if she had expected as much. "And you expect me to hire an untrained designer?" "I expect you to see talent," Celeste shot back. "I don't have credentials, but I know fashion. I know how fabric moves, how a dress should make a woman feel. I just need a chance." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Isabella smirked. "You have fire, I'll give you that." She closed the portfolio and tapped it lightly. "I don't need a designer, but I do need someone who can sew." Celeste's stomach tightened. "A seamstress?" Isabella nodded. "Our clientele demand custom alterations. If you're as good with fabric as you say, prove it. Show me you belong in this world." It wasn't the offer she had hoped for, but Celeste knew better than to walk away. This was her foot in the door. "I'll take it," she said firmly. The next few weeks were grueling. Celeste worked long hours in the boutique's back room, hunched over delicate gowns, fixing hems, adjusting bodices, making the impossible possible for clients who didn't understand the work behind their luxury. It was thankless, exhausting, and beneath the dreams she had once carried, but it was a start. At night, after putting Elijah to bed, she would sit at their tiny kitchen table, sketching under the dim glow of the overhead light. Her hands ached from hours of sewing, but she refused to stop. Her dreams had been buried once, but she was digging them back up, one stitch at a time. Then, one afternoon, Isabella stormed into the back room, tossing a dress onto the table. "A client needs this restructured by tomorrow morning," she said. "Think you can handle it?" Celeste looked at the gown, an intricate midnight blue piece that had been poorly designed. Fixing it in one night would be impossible, but Celeste met Isabella's gaze and nodded. "I'll have it ready." She wasn't just proving herself, she was preparing for the life she was meant to have. Celeste worked through the night, the dim overhead bulb flickering as she stitched, cut, and reshaped the gown with careful precision. The fabric was unforgiving, the original design sloppy, but she refused to let it defeat her. Her fingers were raw, needle pricks dotting her skin, but she pushed through the exhaustion. She wasn't just altering a dress, she was proving that she belonged. By the time the sun rose, the gown had transformed. What had once been an ill-fitting mess now draped flawlessly, the silhouette refined, the seams seamless. Celeste stepped back, heart pounding. She had done it. When Isabella entered the back room that morning, she stopped mid-stride, her sharp eyes scanning the gown now displayed on the mannequin. For the first time, she looked at Celeste with something other than amusement. "This," she murmured, circling the dress, "is impressive." Celeste wiped her tired eyes, swallowing down the lump of pride swelling in her throat. "The original construction was weak," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I had to rebuild the entire bodice and strengthen the hemline." Isabella tapped her manicured nails against her lips, nodding slowly. "You have an eye for detail." "I told you," Celeste said, lifting her chin. "I know fashion." A slow smirk spread across Isabella's face. "Perhaps you do." From that moment on, Celeste was no longer just another seamstress. Isabella began handing her more complex alterations, consulting her on designs, even allowing her to make modifications to dresses before they ever reached the client. Celeste still worked tirelessly, but now she was being noticed. Elijah, however, had started noticing things too. One evening, as Celeste tucked him into bed, he frowned, staring up at her with wide, questioning eyes. "Why doesn't Daddy call? Anymore?" Celeste's breath hitched, but she kept her expression soft. "He's busy," she said gently, "but I'm here, and I always will be." Elijah traced a pattern into his blanket, his small hands fidgeting. "Do you think he misses us?" A lump formed in Celeste's throat. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him that Graham lay awake at night, haunted by the family he had abandoned, but she refused to lie. "I don't know, baby," she admitted, "but what I do know is that we're going to be okay, you and me." Elijah nodded, though his face remained troubled. Celeste kissed his forehead, whispering a silent promise to herself. She wasn't just building a career, she was building a future for her son. A future where he would never have to feel abandoned again. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, and Celeste's name began to circulate among the elite clients of the boutique. Women whispered about the miracle seamstress who could transform any gown into a masterpiece. One evening, a wealthy socialite approached Isabella and asked something Celeste never expected to hear. "Does she design as well?" And for the first time, Isabella hesitated. Then she smiled. "She does." Celeste could hardly believe what she had just heard. Her breath caught in her throat as Isabella smiled at the client, effortlessly selling her as more than just a seamstress. She had spent months proving herself, working tirelessly in the back room, her name spoken only in whispers. But now, in a room filled with the wealthy and powerful, Isabella had placed her on the stage. The socialite, Margot Leclerc, tilted her head, her sharp eyes assessing Celeste like a prized possession. "A designer, you say?" she mused, running her fingers along the beaded neckline of a gown. "Interesting. I have an event in 3 weeks and I need something exclusive. I don't want to walk into a gala and see another woman wearing my dress." Isabella smirked. "Then Celeste is exactly who you need." Margot studied her for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod. "Fine. Impress me." She pulled a card from her clutch and pressed it into Celeste's palm. "I expect a design proposal in 3 days." With that, she turned and strode away, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. Celeste barely moved. The card burned in her hand, her heart hammering in her chest. This was it, her moment. She turned to Isabella, whose smirk hadn't faded. "You wanted a chance," Isabella said, crossing her arms. "Now you have it. Don't waste it." That night, Celeste sat at her kitchen table, her sketchbook open, her pencil poised above the page. But for the first time in years, doubt crept in. Could she really do this? She had spent so long fixing other people's designs, sewing together the broken visions of others. But this was hers. A soft shuffle behind her made her turn. Elijah stood there, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Mom?" he mumbled. "Why are you still awake?" Celeste smiled, closing her sketchbook for a moment. "Just working on something important." Elijah climbed onto the chair beside her, his curls messy from sleep. He looked at the blank page and then up at her. "You always tell me that if you want something really bad, you have to be brave enough to go for it." Celeste felt her throat tighten. He was right. She had fought so hard to get here. Why should fear stop her now? She kissed Elijah's forehead and whispered, "Then I guess I better be brave." As he wandered back to bed, she took a deep breath and let the pencil glide across the paper. The dress began to take shape. Elegant, yet bold. Soft, yet powerful. A statement of resilience. By morning, she had 3 designs ready. When she walked into the boutique, she handed them to Isabella without a word. Isabella flipped through them, her sharp gaze lingering on the final sketch. A slow smile spread across her lips. "Now this," she said, "is something I can sell." Celeste had taken her first real step toward the life she was meant to have. Celeste stood in the fitting room, her hands steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Her dress, was displayed on a mannequin in front of her, the delicate fabric shimmering under the warm lights. She had poured every ounce of her skill, her pain, and her ambition into this design, ensuring that every stitch spoke of elegance and power. It was the first gown she had created under her name, the first step toward reclaiming the dream she had once abandoned. Margot Leclerc arrived precisely on time, her heels clicking against the floor as she swept into the boutique with an air of entitlement. She barely spared Celeste a glance before flicking her wrist toward Isabella. "Is it ready?" she asked, her tone laced with impatience. Isabella merely gestured toward the dress. "See for yourself." Margot's gaze landed on the gown, and for a moment she said nothing. Celeste held her breath, bracing for the sharp criticism that often came from women of her status. But then, something remarkable happened. Margot stepped closer, her fingers brushing the intricate embroidery at the bodice, her lips slightly parted. "This," she murmured, her eyes shining with approval, "is divine." Celeste exhaled slowly, a flood of relief washing over her. Margot turned to Isabella, arching a perfectly shaped brow. "Who designed this again?" Isabella smirked, glancing at Celeste. "She did." Margot's gaze finally met Celeste's. There was something different in her eyes now, not dismissal but recognition. "You have a gift," she admitted. "I wasn't expecting this level of craftsmanship." She turned back to the dress. "I'll wear it to La Nuit de Mode." Celeste's breath hitched. La Nuit de Mode, the most prestigious fashion event of the year, the place where the world's biggest designers showcase their work. If Margot wore her dress there, it would be seen by the industry's elite. Margot waved a hand. "I assume you can handle any final adjustments?" Celeste nodded, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Of course." As Margot disappeared into the fitting room, Isabella turned to Celeste with a knowing smirk. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "looks like you've just made your official debut." Celeste should have felt victorious, and yet, A quiet fear crept into her chest. La Nuit de Mode wasn't just a career milestone. It was an event where the wealthiest, most powerful figures in fashion gathered. And Graham would be there. She hadn't seen him in years, hadn't heard his voice since the day he left. She had built a new life, a new name, without him. But now, fate was forcing their paths to cross once more. She lifted her chin. Let him see. Let him witness what he had thrown away. Because Celeste Sinclair wasn't just surviving, she was rising. The lights of La Nuit de Mode shimmered against the Parisian skyline, casting golden reflections on the polished marble floors of the grand venue. The air buzzed with anticipation, a sea of the industry's most powerful figures moving through the gala in a symphony of whispered deals and hushed admiration. Celeste stood at the edge of it all, her hands clasped together as she surveyed the scene. This was the moment she had fought for. Margot Leclerc, draped in Celeste's creation, moved through the crowd like royalty, the fabric of her gown catching the light with every graceful step. The fitted bodice accentuated her silhouette, while the dramatic train floated behind her like a whisper of power. Everywhere she walked, eyes followed. People murmured, pointing at the dress, at the craftsmanship, at the designer behind it. Celeste had dreamed of this for years, yet nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her work commanding the room. This was her moment of validation, proof that she had not just survived, but thrived. Then she saw him. Graham Sinclair stood near the champagne bar, laughing at something a wealthy investor had said, his arm wrapped lazily around the waist of Victoria Leroux. The sight of them together sent a ripple of something sharp through Celeste. Not pain, not regret, but a quiet, simmering fire. He hadn't changed much, still polished, still exuding the effortless confidence of a man who had never known struggle. But there was something in his eyes as he glanced around the room, something restless, something hollow. And then his gaze landed on her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Celeste could see the flicker of recognition in his face, the way his expression shifted from casual amusement to something darker, something unsettled. She stood taller, allowing the moment to stretch, refusing to look away first. Then, as if the universe had orchestrated the perfect strike, Margot strolled past Graham and Victoria, the crowd parting around her like water. Someone whispered her name, then another, and suddenly all eyes were on the woman in the breathtaking gown. Graham's gaze snapped to the dress. His body stiffened. Celeste watched as realization crashed into him. This was her work. He turned back. To her, his brows furrowed, confusion bleeding into something else, something dangerously close to regret. Celeste smiled. Not a soft, forgiving smile, but one that spoke of victory, of survival, of a woman who had been forged in fire and emerged stronger. Then, without a second glance, she turned away. Let him watch. Let him see. Because for the first time in her life, Celeste Sinclair wasn't the woman he left behind. She was the woman he could never have again. Graham Sinclair couldn't look away. The woman standing across the room, radiating elegance and power, was not the same woman he had left all those years ago. Celeste had changed. No, she had transformed. The quiet wife who once waited for him at dinner, who softened herself to fit his world, was gone. In her place stood someone untouchable, someone undeniable, and worst of all, someone who no longer needed him. His grip on his champagne flute tightened as Margot Leclerc continued her slow walk through the gala, drawing admiring glances, cameras flashing with every step. The dress was a masterpiece, flawless in execution, bold in its statement. And now, Graham knew the truth. Celeste made that. Beside him, Victoria's smile faltered as she caught his expression. She followed his gaze, narrowing her eyes when she spotted Celeste. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Graham didn't answer. His mind was spinning too fast, replaying everything. The years without her, the assumptions he had made. He had left her behind, convinced she would fade into obscurity, just another ex-wife surviving on alimony. But now she was here, standing at La Nuit de Mode, her name spoken in whispers of admiration. "Graham," Victoria pressed, her tone sharper now. Still, he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, driven by something he couldn't fully understand, something desperate. Celeste turned her head slightly, catching his movement. Their eyes met once more, but unlike before, she didn't freeze. She didn't falter. Instead, she smiled. Cool, composed, unreadable. And then, just as effortlessly, she turned away. Graham exhaled sharply. He had never felt invisible before. "Do you know her?" Victoria demanded, crossing her arms. Graham set his glass down on the nearest table, his pulse hammering. "Stay here," he muttered, already stepping away. Victoria scoffed behind him, but he didn't care. He needed to talk to Celeste. He navigated through the crowd, his breaths coming faster as he closed the distance between them. When he reached her, she was in conversation with two designers, effortlessly engaging as if she had belonged in this world all along. "Celeste," he said, his voice just above a whisper. She turned to him slowly, as if she had already predicted this moment. Her expression remained unreadable, her gaze unwavering. "Graham," she said, his name rolling off her tongue with surprising ease. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a calm, confident woman who had moved past him. He swallowed, hard, suddenly unsure of what to say. You look incredible." Celeste tilted her head slightly. "I know." The response caught him off guard, knocking the words from his tongue. She wasn't here to seek his approval. She wasn't waiting for his validation, and for the first time, Graham realized, he wasn't the one in control anymore. Graham swallowed, the weight of Celeste's indifference settling heavy in his chest. He had expected, what? Anger? Bitterness? A confrontation laced with resentment? Anything would have been better than this poised, untouchable version of her. He forced a breath. "Celeste, can we talk?" She arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "We are talking." The words were smooth, effortless, but they carried an edge that made him uneasy. Around them, the gala buzzed with conversation and laughter, the fashion elite mingling in their own world. But for Graham, everything else had faded. "I mean privately," he clarified, stepping closer. "Just for a moment." Celeste considered him for a beat, then let out a quiet hum. "I suppose I can spare a moment." She turned, leading the way through the crowd, and he followed, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Every step felt surreal, as if he were chasing something he had long ago abandoned. They stopped near a secluded balcony, the cool Parisian air brushing against them. The city lights twinkled below, but Graham barely noticed. His attention was solely on Celeste. She leaned against the railing, arms crossed, waiting, not nervously, not eagerly, just waiting. He exhaled sharply. I didn't know you were here." She gave him a small, knowing smile. "I imagine there are many things you don't know about me anymore." The truth of that hit like a punch to the gut. She was right. He had left, assuming she would remain as she was, his wife, the woman who had once waited for him. But this Celeste was different. She had carved out a life without him, one he clearly had no place in. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice low. "I thought—" She cut him off with a quiet laugh. "No, you did mean to hurt me, you just didn't care at the time." His mouth went dry. Celeste tilted her head slightly. "You made your choice, Graham. You walked away. You built a new life." Her gaze flicked over him, unreadable. "Didn't it turn out the way you wanted?" Graham hesitated. For years, he had convinced himself that leaving had been the right decision, that Celeste would fade into the past, that his new life with Victoria would fulfill him. But standing here now, looking at the woman he had abandoned, a gnawing realization settled deep inside him. He had been wrong. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "I regret them." Celeste sighed, shaking her head. "Regret is useless, Graham. It doesn't undo the past. It doesn't change what you did." He wanted to say something, anything that would make her see him differently, that would make her believe he wasn't the same man who had left her behind. But Celeste's expression was final, unreadable, closed, and for the first time Graham realized he was too late. Graham ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. He had come here expecting something, reconciliation, forgiveness, maybe even a second chance. But the woman standing before him wasn't offering any of that. She had moved on, and worse, she didn't even seem to hate him for what he had done. She had simply erased him. "Celeste," he tried again, his voice quieter this time. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to fix things." She let out a soft breath, tilting her head as if considering his words. "Fix things?" she echoed, amusement dancing in her voice. "Graham, you're not trying to fix me. You're trying to fix how you feel about what you did." His jaw clenched. "That's not true, isn't it?" She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "You left. You abandoned our son. You built a life with another woman. And now because I've succeeded without you, suddenly you want to make things right?" She shook her head. "That's not how this works." He exhaled sharply. "I never stopped thinking about you." Celeste's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sigh. "But I stopped thinking about you," she said simply. "That's the difference." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had assumed on some level that Celeste still carried some part of him with her, that despite everything she might still care. But there was no longing in her eyes, no hidden sorrow. She had let him go a long time ago. Graham swallowed, shifting. "Tactics. What about Elijah?" he asked. "I know I failed him. I know I wasn't there, but I want to be. I want a chance to—" Celeste cut him off with a quiet laugh. "You want a lot of things." He fell silent as she turned her gaze toward the city lights. exhaling softly. Elijah grew up without you. He learned how to be strong because of me. He learned that love isn't conditional, that it isn't something that disappears when it's inconvenient. She met his eyes again, and this time, there was something sharp there. You don't get to walk in now and claim him just because you regret what you did. Graham felt the ground shift beneath him. So what? He asked, his voice rough. I never get another chance? Celeste studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. You made your choices, Graham. You don't get to rewrite them, just because you don't like how the story ends. The finality in her voice was like a door slamming shut, and for the first time in his life, Graham Sinclair had no control, no power, no second chances. Celeste turned, stepping back inside. The gala, the warm glow of success enveloping her as she disappeared into the crowd. Graham stood alone on the balcony, the weight of his choices settling in his chest, and for the first time he understood he had lost her forever. Graham stood frozen on the balcony, staring at the place where Celeste had been only moments ago. The weight of her words sat heavy in his chest, a slow, suffocating realization creeping in. There was nothing left for him here. No second chance, no redemption, no way to undo the past. He had spent years thinking of her as someone waiting in the background, a piece of his past that he could return to when it suited him. But she wasn't waiting. She had moved forward while he had stood still. Inside the gala, the music swelled, and the murmurs of the fashion elite filled the space, but Graham barely heard it. He had lost. And not just Celeste. He had lost everything. He turned back toward the party, his gaze searching for her. He spotted her near the runway, standing next to a young man dressed in a tailored suit, his features sharp, his confidence effortless. It took Graham a second too long to register who he was looking at. Elijah, his son. Graham's breath caught. He had barely recognized him. The last time he had seen Elijah, he was a boy. Now he stood tall, poised beside his mother, looking every bit like a man who belonged in this world. He wanted to move, to step forward, to say something. But before he could, Elijah turned, his eyes locking onto Graham's for the first time in years. The cold indifference in his gaze sent a sharp pang through Graham's chest. There was no curiosity, no longing, no trace of the little boy who used to reach for his father's hand. Elijah didn't see him as a missing piece of his life. He saw him as nothing at all. Graham took a step forward, but Elijah had already turned away. He leaned in to whisper something to Celeste, who smiled at her son before the two of them walked toward the stage, toward the future Graham had no place in. A voice snapped him out of his daze. There you are, Victoria. She appeared beside him, slipping a delicate hand around his arm, but he barely felt it. She followed his gaze toward Celeste and Elijah, her lips tightening. You look like a man who just realized he threw away the best thing he ever had. Graham didn't respond, because for the first time he knew she was right. Inside, the lights dimmed and a hush fell over the crowd as Celeste took the stage. The applause was deafening, the world celebrating her success, her triumph, her rebirth. Graham watched, unseen, unacknowledged, and utterly alone. Celeste had not only survived without him, she had thrived, and now, as she took her final bow, he understood the cruelest truth of all. He would spend the rest of his life watching her shine from the shadows, knowing that he had been the one to cast himself into the dark.